The date was June 14th, 1969. 6-year-old Dennis Martin was out enjoying a Father's Day weekend camping trip in the Great Smoky Mountains. Accompanied by his dad, his grandfather, and his older brother, the family had set up near Spence Field, a rugged, high-altitude stretch along the Appalachian Trail. It was meant to be a bonding experience, a simple weekend in nature. Instead, it devolved into one of the most haunting, unsolved mysteries in American history. As the afternoon wore on, Dennis and a couple of other boys hatched a playful scheme. They wanted to hide in the dense brush along the path and jump out to startle the adults as they walked by. To make the prank work, the kids scattered in different directions. Dennis headed one way, while the others took another route. Minutes ticked by. The other children eventually emerged from the trees, but Dennis did not. His father, Bill, immediately sensed something was wrong. He began shouting his son's name frantically, tearing through the undergrowth. But the forest gave nothing back. There was no rustling in the leaves, no response, and absolutely no trace of a little boy wearing a bright red shirt. The landscape here is merciless. The terrain is steep, choked with thick vegetation, and incredibly disorienting. A child could step just a few feet off the trail and become entirely invisible. If Dennis had tripped, stumbled, or simply walked in the wrong direction, the wilderness could have swallowed him in the blink of an eye. And then nature turned against them. Shortly after the boy vanished, the skies opened up. A violent downpour hammered the mountains. Any footprints, disturbed dirt, or scent trails that Dennis might have left behind were literally washed away in real time. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted. For a 6-year-old boy in a summer t-shirt, enduring a freezing, rain-soaked night alone in the wild was a catastrophic threat. By dawn, the search had exploded into a monumental operation. What started as a panicked father looking for his son transformed into a small army. Park rangers, civilian volunteers, Boy Scouts, helicopters, and even heavily trained Green Berets descended on the mountains. Over the course of the search, thousands of individuals scoured the woods. On a single day, an estimated 1,400 people were out looking for him, covering more than 56 square miles of brutal terrain. Yet, despite this massive human effort, they found nothing. There were agonizing false hopes. Small Oxford-style shoe prints matching the type Dennis was wearing were discovered leading toward a creek before vanishing. But authorities quickly dismissed them, believing they were left by a Boy Scout who was helping with the rescue effort. As days bled into weeks, the theories grew darker. The most chilling account came from a man named Harold Key. He told investigators that on the day Dennis disappeared, he heard a blood-curdling scream echoing through the woods. Shortly after, he spotted an unkempt, wild-looking man sprinting through the trees, carrying something red thrown over his shoulder. It was a terrifying lead, but investigators ultimately decided the math didn't add up. They calculated that the wild man was spotted too far away from where Dennis went missing, and the time frame just didn't align. The FBI and park officials dismissed the connection. But the abduction theory has never truly faded away. Bill Martin went to his grave believing his son was kidnapped. And it makes sense. How does a child vanish in broad daylight, triggering the largest search in park history, without leaving a single shred of evidence behind? Official agencies prefer a simpler, though equally tragic theory. They believe Dennis wandered off, succumbed to the elements, and passed away deep in the inaccessible wilderness. Some have pointed to a bear or feral hog attack. But if an animal had taken him, there should have been blood, torn fabric, or drag marks. There was nothing. By late June, the massive search was quietly shut down. Resources were depleted and the mountains had remained entirely silent. Dennis Martin simply ceased to exist. If you looked at Scott Lilly, you wouldn't immediately peg him as a hardcore survivalist. The 30-year-old from South Bend, Indiana, wasn't a veteran outdoorsman, but in the summer of 2011, he decided to strap on a heavy pack and hike southbound on the Appalachian Trail. For Scott, this wasn't just a physical challenge. He was a massive Civil War buff, drawn to the historical battlegrounds of Virginia. It was a pilgrimage of sorts, a way to detach from society, clear his mind, and work through his personal struggles. Scott's journey officially began on June 15, 2011. He aimed to hike from Maryland all the way down to Georgia. It was a grueling itinerary for a beginner, but as he crossed into Virginia, he seemed to be thriving. He successfully navigated a notoriously punishing section of the trail known as the Priest, a peak that towers over 4,000 feet. But as July drew to a close, Scott's trail went cold. Nobody saw or heard from him after July 31st. Authorities theorized he was making his way toward Cow Camp Gap Shelter, a standard overnight stop for backpackers. It made perfect sense. From there, he likely intended to hike down into the town of Buena Vista to grab fresh supplies. On a trail this massive, hikers frequently go days without seeing another human soul. Solitude is the whole point. Nearly 2 weeks after he vanished, a group of hikers walking near Cow Camp Gap stumbled upon a horrifying scene. Just off the trail, they found a hastily dug, shallow grave. Inside it were the remains of Scott Lilly. This was no hiking accident. Someone had intentionally concealed his body. The grave wasn't dug deep enough to keep him hidden forever, but it bought the killer time. The coroner later determined that Scott had been rotting in the earth for nearly 12 days. What makes this case so deeply unsettling is the location. Cow Camp Gap isn't some uncharted, desolate wasteland. It is a highly trafficked recreational corridor. Hikers stop there to eat and campers pitch tents nearby. Whoever murdered Scott Lilly and buried him in the dirt either took an insane, calculated risk or they were a ghost who knew the woods better than anyone else. In January 2012, the medical examiner dropped a bombshell. Scott hadn't been shot or stabbed. His death was officially ruled a homicide by asphyxiation. He had been suffocated. Adding to the mystery, several of his possessions were stolen. His backpack, his brand new hiking boots, a Nintendo handheld game, and his trail guide were all missing. Was a man strangled to death out in the woods just so someone could steal his boots in a video game? Or were these items taken as trophies by a predator? The FBI stepped in, launching a massive joint investigation. They pulled over 100 pieces of physical evidence. They tracked down and interviewed 83 different hikers across several states and 2 countries. They even dangled a $10,000 reward for information, but the case went absolutely nowhere. The killer's identity remains a total blank. People like to imagine the deep woods are filled with feral, dangerous hermits, but the reality of Scott's death is far more disturbing. He was killed on a popular trail, right where ordinary people walk every single day. He simply crossed paths with a monster, and that monster got away with it. Long before the wilderness swallowed 24-year-old Derek Lueking in March 2012, the people who loved him knew a storm was brewing in his mind. In the weeks prior to his trip, Derek's personality had shifted. He started smoking and drinking, vices he had never indulged in before. He seemed lost, deeply dissatisfied with the trajectory of his life. The nightmare kicked off on March 15th when Derek failed to clock in for work. His phone rang endlessly, eventually going to voicemail. Panic set in. His family immediately hit the road, driving through the dark from Virginia all the way to Tennessee. When they hacked into his computer, they found web searches for the Great Smoky Mountains and a booking for a motel in Cherokee, North Carolina. This wasn't a random disappearance. Derek was executing a plan. But what exactly was the end game? Security cameras at the Cherokee Microtel captured Derek checking out at 4:00 a.m. on March 17th. He had a small day pack slung over his shoulder. As he walked out the glass doors, he vanished from the face of the earth. When his family entered his motel room, they found a bizarre scene. A Bible lay open on the bed and an empty liquor bottle sat on the floor. It was the physical aftermath of a man fighting a massive internal war. A few hours later, Derek's white Ford Escape was located at the Newfound Gap parking lot, perched high on the border of Tennessee and North Carolina. Inside the cabin, they found a handwritten note. It contained only 4 words: "Do not follow me." But given the circumstances, ignoring that note was impossible. Search and rescue operations spun up immediately. When police searched his SUV, the situation stopped making sense. Derek had spent a small fortune outfitting himself for the wild. He bought a tent, a premium sleeping bag, survival knives, heavy-duty cord, and rations, but almost all of it was sitting right there in the trunk. He also left his wallet and his cash behind. Why buy top-tier survival gear only to abandon it at the trailhead? Did he plan to hike in a short distance, drop off his day pack, and come back for the rest? Was he playing a dangerous game, trying to test his limits with zero supplies? Or did someone approach his vehicle while he was packing his bag? Scores of searchers and tracking dogs combed through 70 miles of jagged trails. They checked every ravine and drop-off. But the biggest paradox of the case was the environment itself. It was a gorgeous Saturday. The park was swarming with tourists and hikers, yet not a single verified witness could place Derek at Newfound Gap that day. It was as if he materialized out of thin air, left his car, and evaporated. The story took an even darker twist when authorities realized another man had vanished in the exact same area. Michael Giovanni Kulik disappeared just 1 day after Derek was last seen on camera. Michael's car was found parked awkwardly along Newfound Gap Road. Months later, searchers stumbled across Michael's skeletal remains deep in the backcountry. Were the two tragedies linked by a roaming predator, or was it just a macabre coincidence? To this day, Derek's fate is a blank page. If the note was a suicide letter, why did he buy a tent and a sleeping bag? If he was abducted, why was there no sign of a struggle in a parking lot full of tourists? More than 10 years have passed. Derek Lueking is still out there. To know Louise Chaput was to love her. The 52-year-old mother of two radiated warmth and compassion. Her sanctuary wasn't the bustling city, it was the quiet, ancient stillness of the mountains. In November 2001, she had a hiking trip planned with friends. When they backed out at the last minute, Louise refused to cancel. She packed her bags into her silver Ford Focus station wagon and drove south from Quebec, heading straight for the White Mountains of New Hampshire. She booked a room at the Pinkham Notch Lodge, intending to enjoy a brief, solitary weekend and head back to work by Monday morning. It sounded like an idyllic retreat, but the White Mountains, specifically around Mount Washington, are infamous. The weather there doesn't just change, it attacks. The environment is notorious for blinding whiteouts and sub-zero temperatures that can freeze a person solid in hours. Louise crossed the border and arrived at the lodge on a Thursday afternoon. Exhausted from the drive, she didn't want to attempt a major summit. She just wanted to stretch her legs and breathe in the cold mountain air before the sun went down. The front desk clerk suggested the Lost Pond Trail, a short, incredibly easy path located right across the highway. She wasn't embarking on a dangerous expedition, she was taking a 30-minute walk. But Louise never returned to her room. When Monday rolled around and she failed to show up for her shift in Quebec, alarm bells rang. Her boyfriend dialed the authorities and a massive search was triggered. At first, the working theory was obvious. The mountain had claimed her. A solo hiker in November, facing brutal wind chills, it's a recipe for a tragic natural death. If she had slipped on the ice or lost her bearings, the freezing temperatures would have been a death sentence. Searchers pushed into the unforgiving landscape. They battled howling winds, blinding snow squalls, and agonizing cold. Helicopters buzzed over the canopy, scanning for a bright jacket against the white snow. But day after day, they turned up empty-handed. Her silver station wagon remained frozen in the lodge's parking lot. Then, on Thanksgiving Day, the grim discovery was made. A search team found Louise's body, but the location made no sense for a lost hiker. She wasn't wandering blindly in the deep wilderness. Her remains were located just a stone's throw from the trailhead, practically within earshot of civilization. Initially, the public mourned her as another victim of Mount Washington's bitter cold, but 2 days later, the autopsy results shattered that narrative. Louise Chaput had not frozen to death. She'd been viciously stabbed to death. The entire scenario felt like a horrifying setup. The freezing weather, the solo female hiker, the treacherous mountain, it all acted as the perfect camouflage for a brutal murder. But this wasn't an accident. A predator had been lurking on a simple walking path, waiting for a target of opportunity. Decades have slipped by. The killer's trail has gone completely cold. Whoever slaughtered Louise Chaput slipped back into the shadows and vanished. Fall in the Great Smoky Mountains can be breathtaking, but on October 8, 1976, it was the backdrop for a living nightmare. 16-year-old Trenny Gibson was on a horticulture field trip with 40 of her high school classmates. She was a bright, quiet girl with dreams of designing landscapes. Spending a Friday identifying plant species in the mountains should have been the highlight of her semester. The group was assigned to hike the trail to Andrews Bald. The conditions that day, however, were absolutely miserable. A chilling, damp fog hung over the trees and a freezing drizzle soaked the hikers. Trenny hadn't packed a winter coat, so a male classmate loaned her his heavy wool jacket. The teachers laid down 2 absolute rules. Do not step off the marked path and be sitting on the bus no later than 3:30 p.m. After eating lunch at the peak, Trenny separated from her friend and began the descent alone. She was walking with a purpose. Several groups of students passed her on the trail. One girl chatted with her briefly. Another group offered her a spot on a rock to rest her legs, but Trenny politely declined, seemingly in a rush to get back to the warmth of the bus. At approximately 2:50 p.m., a cluster of students walking behind her noticed Trenny pause. She bent down, adjusted something, and stepped off the right side of the trail, disappearing behind a thicket of brush. Nobody ever saw her alive again. When the head count was taken at 3:30 p.m., Trenny's seat was empty. Teachers scrambled back up the slick trail, calling her name into the fog, but she was gone. Within an hour, park rangers had declared a full-scale missing person emergency. The timing was a disaster. As evening approached, the temperature nosedived and a torrential rain began to fall. Visibility dropped to zero, but as searchers combed the exact area where Trenny stepped off the path, they found a chilling clue. The brush had been trampled down, and resting in the mud were 3 discarded cigarette butts and a half-crushed beer can. It looked exactly like someone had been sitting there, waiting in the shadows. Tracking dogs were deployed. They locked onto Trenny's scent and dragged their handlers for nearly a mile and a half, straight toward a paved road, and then the dogs stopped. The scent vanished into thin air. It was the classic sign of someone stepping into a waiting vehicle. Over the next few weeks, an army of over 700 volunteers scoured the mountains. The FBI chased down every rumored sighting, but every single lead hit a dead end. The sheer impossibility of the case is maddening. Trenny was surrounded by 40 classmates on a heavily trafficked trail in the middle of the afternoon. She stepped behind a bush for a few seconds and was wiped from existence. Did she hike down to the road to hitch a ride and climb into the wrong car? Or did someone on that mountain that day witness something terrible and swear themselves to secrecy? Nearly half a century later, Trenny Gibson's fate remains locked inside those mountains. September 25, 1981, began as an entirely unremarkable day for 58-year-old Thelma Melton, a woman everyone affectionately called Polly. That afternoon, Polly and 2 of her closest girlfriends drove to the Deep Creek Trail for a leisurely hike. It was a path Polly knew like the back of her hand. The sun was shining, the creek was running low, and other hikers were passing by with friendly nods. Before leaving her house, Polly had prepped a batch of homemade spaghetti sauce, fully intending to be home in time to serve dinner to her husband. After about an hour of easy walking, the trio hit their turnaround point and started the trek back to the parking lot. That is when reality seemed to fracture. Polly was not an athlete. She was overweight, suffered from severe high blood pressure, and was a chain smoker. She had been taking her time all afternoon, but suddenly, without warning, she accelerated. Her pace quickened into an intense, determined power walk. One of her friends chuckled, calling out to her back, jokingly asking if it was a race. Polly glanced over her shoulder, let out a light laugh, gave a quick wave, and kept pushing forward. She marched up a small incline in the trail, crested the top of the hill, and dropped out of sight. When her friends strolled over that exact same hill just seconds later, they were greeted by empty space. Polly wasn't on the trail. She wasn't in the woods. She was just gone. Assuming she had rushed ahead to use the restroom or meet her husband, the women casually finished their hike. But when they reached the trailhead, Polly's husband was standing by their vehicle, completely alone. Panic set in. The Deep Creek Trail was crowded that day. Surely someone had seen a woman matching Polly's description speed walking past them. But as her friends frantically interrogated passing hikers, they were met with blank stares. Nobody had seen her. By sunset, park rangers were swarming the woods. They thought they had a massive advantage. Polly was wearing shoes with a highly unique tread pattern, but the trail was so packed with tourists that the dirt had been completely trampled. The searchers couldn't even find a single footprint showing where she had veered off the path. When canine units were brought in, the situation turned deeply eerie. The bloodhounds sniffed the exact spot where she had waved goodbye. But instead of picking up a trail into the forest, the dogs simply walked in tight circles, confused, and began to bark and howl. Her scent didn't lead anywhere. It just stopped. Rangers quickly ruled out natural causes. The weather was far too warm for hypothermia, and local wildlife wouldn't have been able to drag an adult woman away without leaving a massive crime scene. As investigators dug into her personal life, strange details floated to the surface. Polly had recently lost her mother and was allegedly battling deep depression. Her husband also reported that a bottle of his prescription Valium had vanished from the house. Had Polly taken the pills, walked into the woods, and intentionally disappeared forever? Another theory suggested a meticulously planned escape. A check written out to Polly was mysteriously cashed in Alabama several months later. But if she ran away to start a new life, she did it without bringing a purse, clothes, or her own medication. Then there's the specter of foul play. Did someone snatch her off the trail, grabbing a woman in broad daylight on a crowded public trail just feet ahead of her friends without making a single sound? In 1988, a judge declared Polly Melton legally dead, but the National Park Service has never closed the file. A woman walked up a hill, waved to her friends, and stepped off the face of the earth. The Appalachian Mountains are breathtaking. They are vast, ancient, and deeply silent. But beneath the canopy of those towering trees, they hide their darkest secrets. For Dennis, Scott, Derek, Louise, Trenny, and Polly, the forest wasn't a place of beauty. It was the terrifying place where their stories abruptly and violently ended.